Games are another way, like rackets, to reinforce our existential positions and advance our script. And games, this is according to Jackie Schiff, we justify what we already are feeling and believing internally and shift the responsibility externally to someone else or something else. And we've been talking a lot about Jackie Schiff. Jackie Schiff was a TA trainer who had an institute, one of the schools in TA called Cathexis, and they used to do reparent. It was called the reparenting school because people would regress to childhood scenes and ages, and they would get reparented. But some ethical issues came up, and that school closed. But there's a lot of good theory that came from it, and so we are going to talk something about Jackie Schiff's theory as the form of how they looked at games also. The definition of the game is a series of ulterior transactions. We were talking about transactions yesterday. Outside of awareness, it's important because we play games and we usually don't realize we're into them until they pay off, until we start thinking about them, in which everyone ends up feeling confused, misunderstood, or negative about themselves or others. And at the end of the game, usually what we are feeling is a racket feeling, either mad or scared or sad. According to the TA theory and the 101, there are 3 ways of identifying rackets, which is the Karpman drama triangle, we'll talk about that, Burns formula G, and the Comfort-Goulding transactional diagram. I just call that the transactional diagram way of looking at it. But we're also going to look at the Schiffian discount model of analyzing games. And also, as Val was mentioning, in Vision's work, the modernism and internalized behavior cycle is also a way of playing the game. And games, degrees of games, I think that Van already mentioned. Games can be first degree, second degree, and third degree. And first degree games are those that are socially acceptable, that people play them and they're low payoff and almost socially acceptable. Second degree games are games in which other people notice that something is going on in the relationship that is not working. Like in a restaurant, you will all of a sudden notice that somebody starts escalating their voices and getting angry with each other, and somebody walks out angry or something. That's an indication that they're playing some game, something is going on there that's socially inappropriate for that setting. So second degree games is when people begin to notice, and you don't want others to notice that you're involved in that process. Third degree games are games that end up in tissue damage. Either you end up in the hospital, you end up dead, you end up in jail. So third degree games are serious, and you want to stop games at least at the second degree so they don't escalate into the third degree. So I'm going to use an example for the Karpman drama triangle. Steve Karpman, who is here at the conference incidentally, talked about the drama triangle and the importance of drama. Van was demonstrating yesterday the importance of drama in our relationships. And so the drama triangle talks about that. And games create drama. And so one game that is very popular is called Why Don't You Yes But? And the example that I gave yesterday was, I don't know what to do about my drinking husband. So that's the initiation, the start, and she's in the victim position. I don't know what to do. But notice that she doesn't ask for it. She's not asking for anything. But the respondent says, well, why don't you go to Al-Anon? Have you tried Al-Anon? Oh, yes, I've gone there, but it just didn't help me, and they didn't understand me, and those people are most seriously disturbed and whatever. And so this goes back and forth, well, why don't you yes, but? Why don't you yes, but? And then finally, one of them, either the rescuer is going to move and say, you're helpless, or the victim is going to move to persecutor and says, you're of no help, either verbally or psychologically. And the game ends when the victim ends up reinforcing the belief that nobody can help me with my problems. And the rescuer or persecutor ends up feeling like these people are, you just can't help this person anymore. So that, and games usually are played from a victim, rescuer, or persecutor position. Another example of a game, and the next page is different examples of games. And I was talking about why don't you yes, but now I got you SOB is a persecutor game. And the example that came to my mind is a couple that I worked with for a long time. And the wife was raised by parents who were irresponsible and not helpful. And she had to be the responsible person. So she didn't trust anybody to help her, and she always had to be in charge. And the husband had a mother who was always angry at him and was telling him that he was no good, and he never amounted to anything, even though he was a very successful man in his career. But in his relationships, he felt unsuccessful. And so she would say, will you fix the lawn sprinkler system? And he would, that's the first move in the game. And he would say yes, even though he knows that he doesn't know how to fix the system. And so time goes on, he doesn't fix the system, and she gets to kick him. So he gets the kick, and I'm sorry I failed again. And she reinforces, I can't trust anybody to take care of me. So that's how this series of transactions reinforce advance our script and reinforce our existential positions. So kick me is a form of it. Schlemiel is a game where you can have people that come into your house and always spill the wine on your carpet or break something, and you say, well, that's okay, and oh, I'm sorry, well, that's okay. The whole purpose of the game is to get forgiven over and over. Stupid is a game played by people who want to and we're going to talk about recreating the symbiosis, where you're smart and I'm not, you're okay and I'm not. So I just don't get it. Well, and over and over, getting it and not getting it is that stupid game. Blemish is a game where somebody finds the fault in somebody all the time. They'll start, I have a friend who is always starting to date and all excited, but I know, and I know she probably knows psychologically, but she doesn't know at the beginning, she's going to find something wrong. And then in a few weeks or a month or so, she's going to be talking about that SOB. He was just not okay and it didn't work out. That's a blemish game. Yeah? If it weren't for is another form of game, and that's where you shift the discomfort to, if somebody else is creating my problems. I have a client that I'm still working with, and he's been married to his wife for a long time, but he's still talking about the misery that he's experiencing because if it weren't for her, she had an affair. If it weren't for her, I would be happy. But he doesn't do anything about it. And but he doesn't. The example that Byrne gave in the book Games People Play is that he gets to blame her instead of owning his fear of going out in the world and experiencing something new, ending that so that he can go and experience something new. So that's how it reinforces the script. The reason I brought uproar and courtroom as examples of games is because games can be played by two people, as the examples that I've been giving, but it can be a multiple people game. Uproar usually is a family where everybody gets involved and the screaming escalates and everybody goes into the room, slams the door. That's an uproar game. And then there's courtroom. And I've seen courtroom happen a lot online where somebody did something to you that hurt your feelings that you think it was awful. So you tell everybody on the mailing list so that you can get them to agree with you that this was awful, this person over there. That's a courtroom game. Eric Byrne also often talked about psychiatry as a game, and that is when instead of being intimate, we talk about analyzing each other. So another way of exploring or diagramming games is the formula G. And this was Byrne's formula. So it starts with the con, and in the example of Why don't you? Yes, but the con is I don't know what to do about my husband or whatever the problem is. But I like to use that problem over and over in order to clarify it. I don't know what to do about my husband. And then the G is the gimmick or the hook. And that's a person that can't. The hook is that if I hear a problem, I feel like I need to do something about it, even though she didn't ask for anything. And so notice that there's an equal after the con and the gimmick. And that means that after when the response is done, the game is going to go on until the payoff. You can't interfere the game at any point after that. You can do something about not playing the game at the con or the gimmick, but once the response starts, it's going to go all the way to the cross. There's going to be a cross-up. The way that games very often to me are confusing with pastimes and rackets. But what makes games different than pastimes and rackets is that there's a cross-up. So we were going in one direction, and all of a sudden we shifted. So that in this example, the response is I'm helping you, and you're helping me. And then all of a sudden there's a cross-up, this is not very helpful. And that's a cross-up, and the payoff is I didn't get any help, and you can't be helped. The switch is the switch in the roles of the drama triangle.
And that creates
the cross-up is the shock. Like the example that Byrne gave, I think, was, you all probably don't remember Mission Impossible. Was it?
Yeah, some of us do.
Where all of a sudden the drama, there's a surprise that I thought we were going in a certain direction. So there is a difference. The shift is a shift in role from victim to persecutor or from...
Okay, and the cross-up is the reaction to
Yeah.
Okay.
And the payoff is a feeling and reinforcing belief that comes at the end. Now I got you, SOB, Nigisab it's called. The example that I gave about that, the con is, will you fix the sprinkler system? Or another one setup that I saw that couple do is she would say, you never check in with me to see how I'm feeling. So will you check in with me and talk about how I'm feeling? Rather than saying, I'm going to let you know that I'm having a feeling. But he says that's a setup. The con is a setup. Will you check with me about how I'm feeling? And the gimmick is, I want to please you, so I say, yes, I'll check in with you. That's a con and the gimmick. You got it? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so then there's a response, which was, yes, I'll check in. And there's a series of things that go on, and all of a sudden, she is feeling annoyed that he's not checking in with her. And so she gets angry at him, and that's the cross-up, and ends up with him feeling like I didn't do it right again, and her reinforcing her belief that nobody cares about her, and she's got to be responsible. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Remember that this is a course to give you all the content that everybody gets, so that when you read the literature in the THA or you go anywhere in the world to talk to somebody about TA, you've gotten all the definitions. And that's why we're looking at all of these ways at looking at games. Whichever way fits for you, use that way. Because we're going to look at two more. We were looking at the formula G, and now we're looking at the Kumper-Goulding model, which I just call the transactional model. And it's basically using the ego states. And the example that is on this slide, there's a student and a professor, and the number one says, the student says, sorry, I'm late with my paper. I stayed up all night working on it. And that's the social level message. Psychological message, it says, I've been a bad boy and I'm a failure. The psychological message for turning in my paper late. And the professor replies by saying, yes, I'm sorry you're turning it in late too. I'm going to have to give you an F. That's a social level message, and the psychological message is, yes, you are a failure. Or you're giving the kick anyway, supporting the kick that the student is setting up. It's just another way of diagramming games. So those were three ways of diagramming games: the drama triangle, formula G, and this transactional diagram. And then the next slide is John James, Muriel James' son, and co-therapist for a long time. This one reminded me of maybe helpful for you. which is John James' game plan, is what keeps happening over and over in your life that you end up feeling bad about? So you ask yourself that. The example that I asked you to look at for the transactional analysis example yesterday, it might be something that happens over and over where you end up feeling bad. So you might want to re-examine that with the idea of games in your mind. And then what happens? What happens first, which is the con, and then what happens next, which is usually the gimmick or the response, and then what happens, which is a cross-up, and how does it end, which is the feeling, and how do you end up with the cross-up, and then how do you end up feeling about yourself? So that's one way of thinking, being aware of the patterns that happen in your life over and over. I'm so aware of people sometimes having patterns that they don't put it together. I remember having a client who I saw who was in his third marriage, and for the third time he had been betrayed by the spouse. And he hadn't put together that it was useful to look at that in terms of what it was saying about him rather than about the people he was marrying. So it's useful to begin to identify patterns. Developmentally, that diagram that you see over there is when a child is an infant for the first 0 to 18 months and then up to about 8 years. The parent is in symbiotic relationship with the child in that they have to think and problem solve for the child. The child cries, the responsible parent responds by giving a bottle, changing the diaper, or figuring out what they need. They need to do the thinking for the child, and they're responding to the discomfort. As a child develops, grows older, they begin by the age of 3 to 8, they begin to develop their adult ego state, the capacity to think and problem solve, and hopefully with the help of parents, they are taught how to problem solve and modeled how to problem solve. And then between 8 and 13, 14, 15, 16, they begin to develop their parent ego state with morals and cultural systems by which to problem solve. And at that point, the symbiosis, that diagram, should change. So at that point, you have the parent and the offspring with all three ego states and the capacity for them to feel, think, and act in order to be responsible. But what happens is that developmentally, there's problems in this happening, sometimes in a separation stage between 18 months and 3 years, and then again at 9, and then again at 15. The separation doesn't happen, and so there's an attempt by this person to try to rehook the symbiosis so that somebody else will solve the problem for them. There's some strategies that are used to try to rehook the symbiosis. A very common word that was used for that phenomenon was called codependency a while back. There was a lot of codependency, talk about codependency. And codependency is, trying to recreate the symbiosis is done by first of all, discounting an internal process that we do about discounting, which is discounting the problem, discounting the solvability of the seriousness of the problem, significance, then the solvability of the problem, and then whether I can solve it or somebody else can help me with it. An example that I think of is a person with a really bad back, and they know I don't have any problem. There's no problem. Or they'll say, yes, I do have a back ache, but it's not significant. And they'll say, yes, it is significant, but there's nothing anybody can do about it. And then, yes, it is significant, it is solvable, but I don't think I have the money or can figure out a way to get the help that I need to solve the problem. So that's a process of discounting, which is an internal process we do to keep the symbiosis going, because somebody's caring for them, giving them strokes about it, and keep the script going. And then there's a series of behaviors that the party will
demonstrate in order to reestablish the symbiosis, to try to, it's an out of awareness way for me to get issues that developmentally should have happened as I was growing up, like learning to think, learning to be angry, learning to take care of myself, to get somebody to do it for me. So it's an out of awareness, and that's what makes it like a game. So the passive behaviors are doing nothing about a problem. And so in the example of the backache, is doing nothing about it. Over-adapting is pleasing others rather than thinking about my problem. The other one is agitating, which is students who are doing this in class. Or the other one, a very common agitation, is somebody with with a crossed leg, and they start going. And you're aware when that's happening that I see that happening, and I have to center myself because they're attempting to shift discomfort. And it is energy. We've talked about the child ego states creates energy with a feeling, a need, in order for us to figure out how to solve it. But if we don't do anything about using that energy to solve the problem, it gets dispersed in other ways, one of which is agitation. Another example that I think of is a man who needs strokes, or is lonely or sad or something, goes to a party and doesn't do anything about it effectively, about meeting or talking to somebody or creating. So drinks a lot. Drinking can be an agitation. Drink, drink, drink. And that escalates into his passing out. So somebody has to pick him up, take him to the hospital, and they've recreated that symbiosis. Somebody else be in charge of me. So it can be either incapacitation or violence. If the person acts out violently, somebody has to stop him, and they've recreated that symbiosis. So it's like a game that happens over and over to reinforce there's something wrong with me or I can't solve my own problems. Yes?
I learned a very positive way to deal with over-adaptation, and when the shifts developed this work, they said there's the most thinking is going on in this stage of passivity than any of the others. And the way to positively guard against over-adapting, which most of us all do sometimes to try to please other people, but is to keep your own goal in mind in every situation.
Right.
Every transaction. Keep
Exactly.
your own goal in mind.
Yeah, and we will talk about that in terms of options for avoiding games. So we've talked now about four, and I know, do you have any questions about the reestablishing of the symbiosis? There's a lot of theory there, and I'm sure, do you have any questions?
I'm just wanting to clarify that I understand that the C is the child or whoever the person is that's
Yeah.
attached to the parent and adult?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a grown-up. That diagram, well, those are dotted lines because it's the child, the little child. But the symbiosis, the unhealthy symbiosis is grown-ups who are in child, having needs, and are not thinking and taking care of themselves to solve the problem, and are hooking somebody else to do it for them.
Parent and adult.
They're hooking somebody else's parent and adult to think and solve the problem for them. And that's how I'm sure you've been in examples where that happens to you. It's like creating messes. Children, grown-up children will create husbands who don't pick up after themselves. And we could give all kinds of practical examples of how that gets reestablished. This reminds me of a friend of mine who said she got stopped by the policeman because she didn't have the right sticker on the car for the update or whatever. And she says, you need to give that to my husband because he's in charge of that.